The morning fog rolled across Lake Serenity like a shroud of forgotten prayers, its tendrils reaching toward the weathered dock where Marcus Sullivan stood, camera bag slung over his shoulder. At 42, he carried the weight of 9 years in the lines around his dark eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and questions that had no comfortable answers. The lake house hadn't changed much since his last visit, the summer before everything fell apart. Same peeling white paint on the shutters, same creaking boards on the front porch, same view of the water that had once brought him peace and now only brought memories he'd rather forget. Marcus had built a career as an investigative journalist precisely because he couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. It was both his gift and his curse, this inability to accept simple explanations when complex truths lay beneath the surface. But Lake Serenity represented the one mystery he'd deliberately walked away from. The one case he'd left unsolved because solving it would have meant confronting the moment his faith died. 9 years ago, 4 friends had set out on what should have been a simple evening boat trip. David Chen, the youth pastor who'd brought Marcus back to faith in college. Sarah Martinez, the social worker whose laugh could light up the darkest room. Tommy Brennan, the mechanic with calloused hands and a heart of gold. And Rebecca Walsh, the teacher who saw potential in every lost soul she encountered. They were the core of Lakeshore Community Church's young adult ministry, the ones who'd made Marcus believe that faith communities could actually change lives for the better. They'd never come back. The official investigation had been swift and conclusive. Recreational boating accident, bodies lost to the deep waters, case closed within 3 months. The community had grieved, held memorial services, and eventually moved on. But Marcus had known something was wrong from the beginning. These weren't inexperienced boaters. David had been sailing since childhood, and the weather that evening had been perfect. The boat had been found drifting empty near the far shore. No signs of struggle, no distress calls, no logical explanation for how 4 competent adults could simply vanish without a trace. Marcus had pushed for a more thorough investigation, had asked uncomfortable questions about financial irregularities he'd noticed in the church's books, had suggested the possibility of foul play. But the church leadership, particularly Pastor William Hartley and Board Chairman Robert Blackwood, had discouraged such thinking. Sometimes, Pastor Hartley had said with that practiced pastoral smile, "We must accept that God's ways are mysterious and beyond our understanding." The dismissal had been the final crack in Marcus's already strained relationship with faith. If God was so mysterious that he'd allow 4 of his most devoted servants to disappear without explanation, then maybe God wasn't worth following at all. Marcus had left Millbrook Falls that autumn, taken a job with a Chicago newspaper, and spent 9 years building a reputation for uncovering corruption in institutions that claimed moral authority. He'd returned now only because his editor had insisted he take a sabbatical after his latest expose, a series revealing financial misconduct in a prominent megachurch, had earned him death threats and a mild nervous breakdown. "Go somewhere quiet," Patricia had said. "Remember why you became a journalist in the first place. Find your center again." The irony wasn't lost on him that his center was the place where he'd lost his faith entirely. Marcus climbed the porch steps, fishing the key from under the ceramic frog where his aunt had always hidden it. The house belonged to him now. Aunt Helen had passed 2 years ago, leaving him her lakeside retreat with a note that said, "Maybe someday you'll need a place to find your way back to yourself." The interior smelled of cedar and old memories. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through windows that looked out over the lake. Marcus set his bags down and walked to the kitchen, where he put on a pot of coffee and tried not to think about the last time he'd stood in this same spot, making breakfast for 5 people who'd been planning their evening boat trip. His phone buzzed, a text from his contact at the county sheriff's office, Detective Maria Santos. She'd been a rookie deputy 9 years ago, the only law enforcement official who'd seemed to share his concerns about the case. Now she was a seasoned detective, and they'd maintained a professional friendship over the years. "Welcome back to town," the text read. "Coffee at the diner? Something you need to see." Marcus replied that he'd be there in an hour, then spent the remaining time unpacking and trying to convince himself that this was just a restful retreat, not a return to the scene of an unsolved mystery. The Millbrook Diner hadn't changed either. Same red vinyl booths, same black and white checkered floor, same smell of bacon grease and strong coffee. Detective Santos was waiting in a corner booth, her dark hair now streaked with premature silver, her expression serious. Maria, Marcus said, sliding into the seat across from her. You look good. Tired, but good. She smiled briefly. You look like hell, Marcus. Chicago not agreeing with you. Chicago's fine. It's everything else that's the problem. He accepted the coffee the waitress poured and added cream, watching it swirl like the fog over the lake. Your text said you had something to show me. Maria glanced around the diner, then leaned forward. 3 days ago, a photographer named Jake Morrison was doing a sunrise shoot down at Willow Point. You know, the rocky outcrop about 2 miles south of where the boat was found. He was climbing around looking for the perfect angle when he spotted something wedged between 2 boulders, just above the high water mark. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was a waterproof camera case, the kind serious photographers used for underwater work, scratched and faded by years of weather and water, but still intact. The serial number, Maria continued, matches a camera that was reported missing 9 years ago, along with 4 friends who went out on a boat and never came back. Marcus stared at the image, his hands trembling slightly. You opened it? Yesterday. The camera inside was damaged, but the memory card was still readable. Most of the photos were corrupted, but we managed to recover one. Maria swiped to the next image on her phone. The last photo on the card. The image was grainy and partially corrupted, but Marcus could make out enough detail to feel his world shift. 4 figures stood on what appeared to be a boat deck, but something was wrong with the composition. The angle was strange, as if the camera had been dropped or thrown. In the background, barely visible through digital noise and water damage, was the silhouette of another boat. And on that boat, Marcus could just make out 2 figures. One tall and thin, one shorter and broader. Jesus, he whispered. The timestamp puts this about an hour after they were supposed to have returned to the marina. Maria said quietly, Marcus, I think your friends were murdered. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus had suspected as much 9 years ago, but having photographic evidence, however corrupted, was different from having theories and gut feelings. Who else knows about this? He asked. Just me, the photographer who found it, and the tech who extracted the image. I wanted to talk to you before I took it to Sheriff Kowalski. Marcus knew what she wasn't saying. Sheriff Kowalski had been one of the officials most eager to close the case 9 years ago, most resistant to Marcus's suggestions of foul play. If there was corruption involved in the original investigation, Kowalski might not be trustworthy. I need to see the original files, Marcus said. Everything from 9 years ago. Case reports, witness statements, forensic analysis, all of it. Maria nodded. I figured you'd say that. I've already pulled the files. But Marcus, if we're going to do this, we need to be careful. If someone killed your friends and covered it up, they might not appreciate us digging around. Marcus looked out the diner window toward the lake, where morning fishermen were heading out in small boats, their lives continuing in the peaceful rhythm that had been shattered for him 9 years ago. David Chen was the best person I ever knew, he said quietly. Sarah Martinez spent her weekends volunteering at the homeless shelter. Tommy Brennan fixed cars for free for anyone who couldn't afford repairs. Rebecca Walsh stayed after school every day to help kids with their reading. He turned back to Maria. If someone killed them, I don't care how dangerous it gets. We're going to find out who and why. Maria reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I was hoping you'd say that. But Marcus, are you sure you're ready for what we might find? Sometimes the truth is worse than the mystery. Marcus thought about the last 9 years, the anger and emptiness that had driven him from one expose to another, always seeking justice for other people's tragedies because he couldn't find it for his own. The mystery is killing me slowly, he said. I'd rather face the truth all at once. Echoes of faith. The Millbrook Falls County Sheriff's Department occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, its American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. Marcus followed Detective Santos through the back entrance, avoiding the front desk where he might encounter Sheriff Kowalski before he was ready for that conversation. Maria's desk was in the detective's bullpen, a cramped space with 4 desks arranged back to back. She pulled out a banker's box labeled Chen David, case the 2016-0847, and set it on an empty conference table. I made copies of everything before I called you, she said, unlocking the box. Original files stay here, but you can take these with you. She handed him a thick manila folder. Start with the witness statements. I'll be interested to hear what you remember versus what people told us officially. Marcus opened the folder and immediately saw a name that made his jaw clench. Pastor William Hartley's statement was on top, dated 3 days after the disappearance. He read through the carefully worded account of how the four friends had seemed excited but not unusual before their boat trip, how they'd been dedicated members of our church family, and how their loss was a test of faith for our entire community. What the statement didn't mention was the heated argument Marcus had witnessed between Pastor Hartley and David Chen the week before the boat trip. David had come to Marcus afterward, clearly troubled, and said, "I think we need to look more carefully at where our mission money is actually going." But when Marcus had pressed for details, David had said he needed to gather more evidence before making any accusations. "This is sanitized," Marcus said, showing Maria the statement. "Hartley makes it sound like everything was perfect in their little church family. But David was investigating something, financial irregularities, I think. He was suspicious about missing funds from the mission budget." Maria made a note. "Did he share any specifics with you?" "Not really. David was always careful about accusations. He wanted proof before he'd say anything publicly." Marcus flipped to the next statement, this one from Robert Blackwood, the church board chairman. "But I got the impression he was close to finding something significant." Blackwood's statement was even more carefully neutral than Hartley's. As the church's primary financial overseer, he'd provided a clean bill of health for all church accounts, noting that David had occasionally asked questions about budget allocations, as any responsible board member might do. Marcus snorted. David wasn't on the board. He was a youth pastor. Why would he be asking about budget allocations unless he suspected something? The next few statements were from other church members, all painting the same picture of four beloved friends who'd simply had a tragic accident. But as Marcus read between the lines, he began to notice something. None of the statements mentioned the tension that had been building in the church that summer. There had been whispered conversations in the parking lot after services, small groups of people who'd stopped talking when others approached, a general sense of unease that Marcus had attributed to normal church politics at the time. "Here," he said, pointing to a statement from Margaret Foster, the church secretary. "She says the four friends seemed happy and at peace before their trip. But I remember Margaret being upset about something that whole month. She kept talking about people not being who they seemed to be." Maria was taking notes. "Upset about what? I don't know. But if I had to guess, I'd say she knew something about whatever David was investigating." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Margaret died about 6 months after the boat incident. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected. She was only 55. They exchanged a look. Two potential witnesses to financial misconduct, both dead within a year of each other. It could be coincidence, but Marcus had learned not to believe in coincidences when corruption was involved. The forensic reports were frustratingly thin. The boat had been processed for evidence, but the analysis had been cursory at best. No fingerprints had been lifted except those of the four victims. No foreign DNA had been found. No signs of struggle or violence had been noted. The boat's engine had been in good working order, the fuel tank nearly full, the safety equipment all accounted for. "This is amateur hour," Marcus said, reading through the technical analysis. "They barely tested anything. Look at this. They didn't even check for blood traces using luminol. Any decent forensics team would have gone over every inch of that boat looking for signs of what happened." "Budget constraints," Maria said dryly. "That's what Sheriff Kowalski said when I was a rookie. We can't afford to chase ghosts with expensive tests when the cause of death is obvious." Marcus was about to respond when a shadow fell across the conference table. He looked up to see Sheriff Kowalski himself, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and small, suspicious eyes. "Well, well," Kowalski said, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a politician. "Marcus Sullivan, heard you were back in town. Terrible shame about your friends, but I thought we put that tragedy to rest years ago." Marcus stood, extending his hand in a gesture that was more challenge than greeting. "Sheriff, just reviewing some old files with Detective Santos. You know how it is. A journalist's curiosity never really dies." Kowalski's grip was firm but brief. "Curiosity killed the cat, as they say. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, especially when reopening old wounds might hurt the families involved." "What families would those be, Sheriff?" "As I recall, none of the four victims had close relatives in town. Their parents moved away after the memorial services." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "The church family, son. Pastor Hartley and the congregation. They've found peace with this tragedy. Stirring up conspiracy theories isn't going to bring your friends back, and it might damage a lot of good people who are just trying to serve the Lord." Marcus felt his old anger rising. And if those good people had something to do with my friends' deaths, what then? Now that's enough, Kowalski said, his voice hardening. I won't have you spreading wild accusations in my department. Those were good Christian folks who died in a boating accident. Nothing more, nothing less. The case is closed, and it's going to stay closed. Before Marcus could respond, Detective Santos intervened. Sheriff, we just received some new evidence. A camera belonging to one of the victims washed up 3 days ago. There's a photo on it that raises some questions about the timeline. Kowalski's face went very still. What kind of photo? Maria showed him the corrupted image on her phone. The sheriff studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Looks like digital noise to me, he said finally. Water damage, corrupted data. You can't tell anything from this mess. The timestamp suggests, Maria began. The timestamp could be wrong. These things malfunction all the time, especially after years underwater. Kowalski handed back the phone. Detective Santos, I think you're letting your friendship with Mr. Sullivan cloud your professional judgment. This case was thoroughly investigated and properly closed. I don't want to hear any more about it unless you have something more substantial than a blurry photograph. He turned to Marcus. And you, son. I understand you've had some stress in your career lately. Accusations, threats, that sort of thing. Maybe you should focus on rest and recovery instead of chasing ghosts from your past. The implied threat was clear, and Marcus realized that Kowalski knew more about his recent troubles than a small-town sheriff should reasonably know. Someone had been checking up on him, preparing for his return. I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, Marcus said carefully. I'm sure you're right that rest is what I need. Kowalski smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good man. Millbrook Falls is a peaceful town, Mr. Sullivan. I'd hate for anything to disturb that peace. After the sheriff left, Maria and Marcus sat in silence for several minutes. Well, she said finally. That was interesting. He knows something, Marcus said. The way he reacted to that photo, that wasn't skepticism, that was fear. Or it was an honest assessment of corrupted evidence by a career law enforcement officer. Marcus looked at her sharply. You don't believe that? No, Maria admitted. I don't. But we're going to need a lot more than suspicions and a damaged photograph if we want to challenge a case that's been closed for 9 years. Marcus gathered the copied files and stood. Then we'd better get to work. As they left the sheriff's department, Marcus noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street, its driver obscured by tinted windows. The truck pulled out behind them as they drove toward the lake, maintaining a careful distance. Marcus said nothing to Maria but made a mental note of the license plate in his rearview mirror. Someone was definitely interested in their investigation. The question was whether that someone was trying to help or trying to stop them. The weight of memory. The Lakeshore Community Church sat on a hill overlooking the water, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like an accusation. Marcus parked across the street and stared at the building where he'd once found hope, community, and purpose. The sight of it now filled him with a complex mixture of nostalgia and anger. It was Tuesday afternoon, and the church appeared empty except for a few cars in the parking lot. Marcus had called ahead and arranged to meet with Pastor Hartley, ostensibly to discuss his friend's memorial and his own spiritual journey since returning to town. He'd been deliberately vague about his true purpose, allowing the pastor to assume this was a grieving man seeking comfort rather than a journalist seeking truth. The church's interior was exactly as he remembered. Polished wooden pews, stained glass windows depicting scenes from the New Testament, a simple cross hanging above the altar. But now the familiar space felt hollow to Marcus, like a movie set designed to evoke feelings he no longer possessed. Pastor William Hartley emerged from a side office, arms outstretched in the gesture that had once made Marcus feel welcomed and accepted. At 62, Hartley was still an imposing figure. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that could hold a congregation's attention through a 40-minute sermon. His smile was warm and practiced, his voice rich with pastoral concern. "Marcus, my son," he said, embracing Marcus with the familiarity of someone who'd baptized him 8 years earlier. "It's so good to see you, though I wish the circumstances of your return were happier. I heard about your troubles in Chicago. Persecution for seeking truth is something we believers understand all too well." Marcus allowed the embrace, but didn't return it. "Thank you for seeing me, Pastor. I know you're busy. Never too busy for a member of our church family, regardless of how long you've been away." Hartley gestured toward his office. "Come, let's talk privately." The pastor's office was a testament to decades of ministry. Bookshelves lined with theological texts, framed photos of church events and mission trips, diplomas and certificates covering one wall. Behind Hartley's desk hung a large painting of Jesus walking on water, his face serene despite the storm surrounding him. "So," Hartley said, settling into his leather chair, "what brings you home after all these years? Are you perhaps ready to return to the faith that once brought you such peace?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about David, Sarah, Tommy, and Rebecca lately. About the last time I saw them, the conversations we had. I'm trying to make sense of what happened to them, and to me, that summer." Hartley's expression grew solemn. "A terrible tragedy. 4 of our brightest lights, taken from us in their prime. But we must trust that God had a purpose, even in something so painful." "David seemed troubled those last few weeks," Marcus said, watching Hartley's face for any reaction. "He came to me with concerns about church business. Financial matters, I think." There, just the slightest tightening around the pastor's eyes, quickly covered by an expression of patient confusion. "Financial matters? I'm not sure what you mean, Marcus. David was a youth pastor, not involved in our budget or administrative decisions. Perhaps his concerns were more personal in nature? Maybe. But he mentioned something about mission funds, money that wasn't going where it was supposed to go. He seemed to think someone was redirecting donations." Hartley was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of his face. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of gentle reproach. "Marcus, grief can sometimes make us remember things differently than they actually happened. David was passionate about our mission work, it's true, but he never expressed any concerns to me about financial irregularities. Our books are audited annually by a certified accounting firm, and we've never had any issues." "Which firm handles your audits?" "Blackwood and Associates," Hartley said without hesitation. "Robert Blackwood. You remember Robert, our board chairman. His accounting firm has served the church for over 15 years. Impeccable reputation." Marcus felt a chill. Robert Blackwood was both the church's board chairman and its auditor? That was a massive conflict of interest, the kind of setup that made financial misconduct not just possible but likely. Isn't that unusual? Having your board chairman also serve as your independent auditor? Hartley's smile became slightly strained. "Robert has served this church faithfully for decades. We trust him completely, and his services are provided at a significant discount. A donation to the ministry, really. In a small town like ours, you work with the people you know and trust." "Of course," Marcus said. "I'm sure Robert is completely trustworthy. It's just that David seemed to think." He let the sentence trail off, as if uncertain whether to continue. "What did David think, Marcus?" There was something different in Hartley's tone now, a subtle urgency beneath the pastoral warmth. He thought someone might be using the church's tax-exempt status to launder money. He'd noticed patterns in the donations, large cash gifts that didn't match the reported income of the donors, mission expenses that seemed inflated, that sort of thing. It was a calculated risk, revealing what David might have discovered. But Marcus needed to see how Hartley would react to specific accusations. The pastor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, and something that might have been fear before settling on sorrowful disappointment. "Oh, Marcus," he said softly, "I think I understand what's happening here. You're looking for someone to blame for your friends' deaths, some explanation that makes sense of a senseless tragedy. But sometimes bad things happen to good people, and there's no deeper meaning, no conspiracy to uncover. So you're saying David never raised any concerns about church finances?" "I'm saying that if David had serious concerns, he would have come to me directly. We had that kind of relationship, complete trust and open communication. The fact that he supposedly shared these worries with you instead of his pastor suggests they weren't real concerns but perhaps personal anxieties about other matters." Hartley leaned forward, his expression becoming intensely compassionate. "Marcus, I've watched you struggle with faith ever since your friends died. You've been angry at God, angry at the church, angry at anyone who suggests that sometimes we must accept what we cannot understand. But this investigation you're conducting, it's not going to bring them back or give you the peace you're seeking. What if it brings justice?" "Justice?" Hartley's eyebrows rose. "Justice for what? A boating accident?" Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Hartley the corrupted photograph. This camera belonged to David. It washed up 3 days ago. The last photo on it was taken an hour after they were supposed to return to the marina. Hartley studied the image, his face carefully neutral. I'm afraid I can't make out much detail in this photograph. It appears to be quite damaged. You can see there's another boat in the background. 2 figures on that boat. Can I? It looks like digital artifacts to me. The kind of distortion you get when electronic equipment is damaged by water. Hartley handed back the phone. Marcus, please don't let desperation make you see things that aren't there. The dismissal was smooth and practiced, but Marcus caught something in the pastor's eyes. A flicker of recognition, quickly hidden. Hartley had seen something in that photograph, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Pastor, Marcus said, if there's anything you're not telling me about what happened that night, anything at all, I need to know. Those were my closest friends. I deserve the truth. Hartley stood, signaling that the meeting was over. The truth, my son, is that 4 wonderful people died in a tragic accident, and no amount of investigation is going to change that. I understand your need for answers, but sometimes the only answer is faith. Faith that God works all things together for good, even when we can't see his plan. Marcus rose as well, recognizing that he'd pushed as far as he could for now. Thank you for your time, Pastor. I hope you're right about everything. I'll pray for you, Marcus. I'll pray that you find the peace that's been eluding you all these years. As Marcus left the church, he felt eyes watching him from the windows. The black pickup truck from earlier was parked at the far end of the lot, engine running. Marcus couldn't see the driver, but he had the distinct feeling that his every move was being monitored and reported. He drove back to the lake house, his mind racing with questions and suspicions. Pastor Hartley's responses had been too smooth, too prepared. The man was hiding something, and Marcus was beginning to suspect it was far more serious than simple financial misconduct. His phone rang as he pulled into the driveway. Detective Santos. Marcus, we need to talk. I've been going through the old case files more carefully, and I found something interesting. Can you meet me at the Willow Point tomorrow morning, where the camera was found? What did you find? I'd rather show you in person. But Marcus, I think you were right 9 years ago. I don't think your friends died in an accident. After she hung up, Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, staring out at the lake where his friends had vanished. The water was calm and beautiful in the late afternoon light, giving no hint of the secrets it might be hiding. But Marcus was beginning to suspect that the real secrets weren't hidden in the lake at all. They were hidden in the hearts of people he'd once trusted, people who wore the mask of righteousness while serving darker purposes. Tomorrow, he would begin to uncover those secrets. And if his suspicions were correct, some very respectable citizens of Millbrook Falls were about to have their worst nightmares come true. Stones and secrets. The sunrise at Willow Point painted the lake in shades of gold and crimson, but Marcus found no peace in the beauty. He stood among the granite boulders where David's camera had been wedged for 9 years, waiting for Detective Santos and trying to imagine the last moments of his friends' lives. Willow Point jutted into the lake like an accusation, its rocky shore a maze of crevices and hidden spaces where evidence could remain concealed for years. Marcus had been here many times as a child, fishing with his uncle or exploring the tidal pools that formed among the stones. It was a place of childhood wonder that had now become associated with death and mystery. Maria arrived precisely at sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. She looked tired, as if she'd been up most of the night, and her expression was grim. "Thank you for meeting me here," she said, pouring coffee for both of them. "I wanted to show you what I found away from the department, where we can talk freely." She opened the folder and pulled out a detailed map of the lake, marked with various colored pins and annotations. "I spent yesterday reconstructing the timeline of that night, using the original witness statements and physical evidence. Look at this." The map showed the intended route of the boat trip, a simple circuit around the lake that should have taken about 2 hours. Red pins marked the dock where they'd launched, green pins showed their planned stops, and a blue pin marked where the empty boat had been found. "Here's what doesn't make sense," Maria said, pointing to the blue pin. "The boat was found here, drifting near the eastern shore, but the current that night was running west to east, and the wind was out of the southwest. If they'd had engine trouble or some other emergency anywhere along their planned route, the boat should have drifted toward the western shore, not the eastern." Marcus studied the map. So either they changed their route for some reason or the boat was deliberately moved to the eastern shore to make it look like they'd had trouble in deeper water. Maria pulled out another document. "I also found something interesting in the original forensics report, something that was noted but not properly investigated. She showed him a photograph of the boat's interior, taken by the crime scene photographers. Look at the stern, near the engine housing. Marcus squinted at the black and white image. Is that a stain? The report notes, possible fuel stain, consistent with normal engine maintenance. But look at the shape and location. Fuel stains from normal maintenance would be near the fuel lines or the engine itself. This stain is on the deck in a splatter pattern. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Blood. That's what I think too. But nobody tested it. The investigation was so focused on the obvious explanation, accidental drowning, that they didn't look for evidence of violence. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, the familiar rage that had driven him to expose corruption wherever he found it. They didn't want to find evidence of violence. The fix was in from the beginning. Maria nodded grimly. I think so too, and I think I know why. She pulled out another document, this one a bank statement. I did some digging into the church's finances going back to the months before your friends disappeared. Look at this pattern of deposits. The statement showed a series of large cash deposits, each just under the $10,000 threshold that would require federal reporting. The amounts varied, $9,800, $9,200, $9,750, but the pattern was unmistakable. Money laundering, Marcus said immediately. Classic structuring to avoid detection. Gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Maria showed him a second bank statement. This is from Robert Blackwood's personal account. Look at the withdrawal pattern. Large cash withdrawals that correspond almost exactly to the church deposits. Marcus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Blackwood was using the church to clean his money. But where was the dirty money coming from? That's where it gets really interesting. Maria pulled out a police report from the state database. Robert Blackwood's accounting firm has been under investigation by the State Revenue Department for the past 3 years. Suspicion of helping clients evade taxes, fraudulent deductions, phantom charitable donations. The kind of high-end white-collar crime that generates a lot of cash that needs to be cleaned. And if David Chen discovered the money laundering, he'd have enough evidence to destroy not just Blackwood, but Pastor Hartley and anyone else who was involved. Maria closed the folder. Marcus, I think your friends were killed because they stumbled onto a criminal conspiracy that went to the highest levels of this town's leadership. Marcus stared out at the lake, imagining David and the others on their boat, perhaps confronting their killers with evidence of the financial crimes they'd discovered. Had they arranged to meet someone that night? Had they thought they were dealing with fellow Christians who would do the right thing when confronted with the truth? We need more evidence, he said finally. Bank records, accounting documents, communications between Blackwood and Hartley. The kind of paper trail that proves conspiracy. Agreed. But Marcus, we need to be careful. If we're right about this, we're dealing with people who've already killed 4 times to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. As if summoned by her words, the sound of an approaching engine echoed across the water. Both Marcus and Maria turned to see a boat heading directly toward Willow Point, moving faster than was safe in the rocky shallows. The boat's occupants became visible as it drew closer. 2 men in fishing gear, their faces obscured by baseball caps and sunglasses. But something about their posture, their purposeful approach, set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. Maria, he said quietly, those aren't fishermen. She was already reaching for her service weapon. Get behind the rocks, now. The boat cut its engine and glided into the shallow water near the point. The 2 men stood up, and Marcus could see they were holding something more dangerous than fishing rods. Detective Santos, one of them called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water. Mr. Sullivan, you folks are trespassing on private property. This is public land. Maria called back, her gun drawn but held low, not yet directly threatening. You need to identify yourselves. The second man laughed. We're concerned citizens, detective. Concerned about people spreading lies and disturbing the peace of our community. Marcus recognized the voice now. Robert Blackwood himself, the church board chairman whose financial schemes had apparently cost 4 lives. The man beside him was younger, broader, with the kind of build that suggested he was used to solving problems with violence rather than words. Mr. Blackwood, Marcus called out, stepping partly into view behind a large boulder. Fancy meeting you here. Come to reminisce about old times. Blackwood's face was hard, all pretense of Christian charity gone. I came to give you some friendly advice, Sullivan. The kind your friends should have listened to 9 years ago. Which was, mind your own business. Leave sleeping dogs lie. There are some stones that shouldn't be turned over. Maria kept her weapon ready. Mr. Blackwood, you and your friend need to leave. This is an active police investigation. Investigation into what? Blackwood sneered. 4 people who died in a boating accident? Ancient history, detective. The kind of history that certain people in this town would prefer stayed buried. The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a thick local accent. Boss, we should just... Shut up, Dale. Blackwood's command was sharp. He turned back to Marcus and Maria. You want to know what happened to your friends Sullivan? They got greedy, started asking questions they had no business asking, making threats they couldn't back up. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. You're confessing. I'm stating facts. David Chen thought he was some kind of crusader for justice. Came to me with wild accusations about church finances. Threatened to go to the authorities unless I came clean about supposed irregularities. Blackwood laughed bitterly. That boy had no idea what he was stepping into. So you killed them. We defended ourselves and our community from troublemakers who would have destroyed good people's lives over their self-righteous crusade. Blackwood's voice was rising, years of suppressed anger and justification pouring out. You think this town would be better off if our church closed down? If dozens of families lost their jobs because some punk kid couldn't mind his own business? Dale shifted nervously in the boat. Mr. Blackwood, maybe we should... Should what? Should let them destroy everything we've built here? Let them tear down the pillars of this community because they can't accept that sometimes good people have to make hard choices. Maria stepped forward, her weapon now raised. Robert Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murders of David Chen, Sarah Martinez, Thomas Brennan, and Rebecca Walsh. Blackwood laughed again. With what evidence? The word of a disgraced journalist and a camera that's been underwater for 9 years? You think Sheriff Kowalski is going to support your investigation when he's been taking our donations for years? The confession was everything Marcus had hoped for, but he realized with growing dread that Blackwood wasn't worried about being arrested. Men who expected to walk away from murder accusations didn't typically confess so freely. Dale, Blackwood said quietly, take care of our problem. The younger man raised what Marcus now saw was a hunting rifle, its barrel swinging toward Maria. But the detective was already moving, diving behind a boulder as the shot echoed across the lake. Maria! Marcus called out, unable to see if she'd been hit. I'm okay, came her voice from behind the rocks. But we're pinned down. Marcus pulled out his phone, trying to call 911, but discovered he had no signal among the granite formations of Willow Point. They were on their own, trapped between armed killers and the deep water of the lake. Another shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off stone with a sharp whine. Marcus pressed himself against his boulder and tried to think. Blackwood and Dale had the advantage of mobility. They could maneuver their boat to get better angles on the rocky shore, but they also had to be careful not to damage their escape route. You can't run forever, Sullivan, Blackwood called out, and you can't prove anything without that camera evidence, which is about to be lost forever in a tragic boating accident. Marcus understood. They weren't just trying to kill him and Maria. They were planning to stage another accident, making it look like the journalist and the detective had drowned while investigating the original incident. The poetic justice would appeal to Blackwood's sense of irony, but the accountant had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed Marcus was the same broken man who'd left town 9 years ago, the one who'd given up on faith and justice when the investigation had been shut down. He didn't realize that Marcus had spent the intervening years learning how to fight corruption, how to gather evidence and protect sources. Marcus pulled out a small digital recorder from his jacket pocket, a journalist's best friend, always running during interviews. He'd been recording since before Blackwood arrived, capturing every word of the confession. More importantly, the recorder was equipped with GPS tracking and automatic cloud backup. Even if Marcus didn't survive, the evidence would. Maria, he called out softly, I need you to create a distraction. I'm going to try to reach deeper water. Are you insane? They'll pick you off the moment you break cover. Maybe, but this conversation is being recorded and uploaded in real time. If they kill us, the evidence still exists. Another shot, closer this time. Blackwood was growing impatient, and his partner Dale was clearly nervous about the extended firefight. Marcus took a deep breath and broke from cover, running low toward the water. The rifle cracked again, the bullet passing close enough for him to feel its wind. He dove into the lake just as Maria opened fire from her position, forcing the gunmen to take cover in their boat. The water was shockingly cold, but Marcus was a strong swimmer. He stayed underwater as long as his lungs allowed, then surfaced behind a fallen tree that had drifted near the shore. From this position, He could see the boat and its occupants without being seen. Dale was reloading his rifle while Blackwood worked the boat's engine, apparently trying to maneuver closer to Maria's position. But the detective had shifted locations and was now in a spot where the boat couldn't approach without exposing its occupants to return fire. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of approaching sirens echoed across the lake. Someone had heard the gunshots and called the authorities, or perhaps Maria had managed to reach her radio. "Time to go," Blackwood said urgently. "We'll finish this later." But Dale was staring at something in the water near Marcus's position. "Boss, look. There's something there." Marcus followed his gaze and felt his heart stop. Wedged among the rocks in shallow water, partially obscured by algae and silt, was what appeared to be human remains. The bones were yellowed and scattered, but clearly visible now that the recent storms had shifted the lake's sediment. "Jesus Christ," Dale whispered. "Is that—" "Shut up and start the engine," Blackwood ordered, but his face had gone white. The discovery of bodies would make this situation infinitely more complicated. The sirens were getting closer, and Marcus could see police boats approaching from the main marina. Blackwood and Dale were trapped between the approaching authorities and the evidence that could finally convict them. "This isn't over, Sullivan," Blackwood called out as the boat's engine roared to life. "You think you've won, but you have no idea how deep this goes." The boat sped away toward the eastern shore, but Marcus could see it wouldn't reach safety before the police intercepted it. After 9 years, the killers of his friends were finally going to face justice. Maria emerged from behind her boulder, her weapon still drawn but lowered. "Are you hit?" Marcus waded back toward shore, water streaming from his clothes. "I'm fine. But Maria, look." He pointed toward the bones in the shallow water. "Dear God," she breathed. "Marcus, I think we just found your friends." Resurrection of truth. The next several hours passed in a blur of police activity, crime scene tape, and media attention that descended on Millbrook Falls like a plague of locusts. The peaceful lake town found itself at the center of a murder investigation that would make national news within days. Marcus sat in a blanket on the dock, having given his statement 3 times to various law enforcement officials. The state police had taken over the investigation from Sheriff Kowalski, who was himself now under investigation for obstruction of justice, and the FBI had been called in to examine the financial crimes that had motivated the murders. Detective Maria Santos coordinated the recovery of the remains from the shallow water near Willow Point. The bones were scattered and weathered, but the forensics team was confident they belonged to 4 individuals who had died approximately 9 years earlier. Dental records would provide final confirmation, but Marcus knew in his heart that David, Sarah, Tommy, and Rebecca had finally been found. Robert Blackwood and his accomplice Dale Morrison, who turned out to be a local handyman with a history of violent crime, had been arrested after a brief chase across the lake. Blackwood's boat had mechanical problems that forced him to accept capture rather than risk drowning, an irony that Marcus found grimly appropriate, but the investigation was far from over. Blackwood's initial confession at Willow Point had been followed by complete silence once his lawyer arrived. The financial evidence was strong, but proving the specific details of the murders would require careful reconstruction of events from 9 years ago. As the sun set over Lake Serenity, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since the morning's dramatic confrontation. The lake looked peaceful again, its surface reflecting the orange and purple clouds of evening, but Marcus knew he would never see it the same way again. Father Michael Torres, the young assistant pastor who had taken over much of the church's operations after Pastor Hartley's arrest, approached the dock where Marcus sat. The priest was in his early 30s, with kind eyes and the kind of quiet presence that suggested genuine faith rather than political ambition. "Mr. Sullivan," he said softly, "I wanted to offer my condolences on the loss of your friends, and my apologies for the actions of those who should have protected them." Marcus looked up at the priest. "Did you know about the money laundering, the corruption?" Father Michael sat down beside him on the dock. "I suspected something was wrong. The financial records never quite made sense, and there were too many conversations that stopped when I entered the room. But I was young, new to the parish, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to question my superiors. And now I realize that silence in the face of evil is complicity. Your friends died because good people, myself included, failed to speak up when we should have." The priest's voice was heavy with regret. "I'll carry that burden for the rest of my life." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the water lap gently against the dock pilings. "Father," Marcus said finally, I lost my faith when my friends disappeared. I couldn't understand how God could allow such evil to triumph, how people who claimed to serve him could commit murder and cover it up for years. And now? Marcus considered the question carefully. I'm not sure. Part of me wants to say that God brought us to this moment, that he ensured justice would finally be served. But another part of me thinks it was just human determination and a lucky break with that camera washing ashore. Father Michael nodded. Faith isn't about having certainty, Mr. Sullivan. It's about choosing to believe in goodness and justice even when the evidence seems to point the other way. Your friends never lost that faith, even in their final moments. The evidence we've uncovered suggests they went to that boat meeting believing they could convince Mr. Blackwood to do the right thing. Or they were naive. They were hopeful. There's a difference. The priest stood up. The church will be holding a proper memorial service for your friends next Sunday if you'd like to attend. No politics, no agenda. Just a celebration of 4 lives that touched many people. Marcus wasn't sure he was ready for that, but he nodded. I'll think about it. As Father Michael walked away, Detective Santos approached with a thick folder under her arm. Final reports, she said, sitting down where the priest had been. Thought you'd want to see them before they become public record. Marcus opened the folder and read through the forensic summary. The bones found at Willow Point belonged to David Chen, Sarah Martinez, Thomas Brennan, and Rebecca Walsh. All 4 had died from gunshot wounds, and the condition of the remains suggested they had been weighted down and dumped in deep water before eventually shifting to the shallows during storms over the years. The financial investigation had uncovered a sophisticated money laundering operation involving not just the church, but several other local businesses and charities. Blackwood's accounting firm had been the hub of the scheme, helping wealthy clients evade taxes while cleaning their money through fake charitable donations and inflated business expenses. Pastor Hartley had been arrested at his home that afternoon, charged with conspiracy and accessory to murder. His claims of innocence would be difficult to maintain in light of bank records showing regular payments from Blackwood's firm to accounts controlled by the pastor. Sheriff Kowalski was facing charges for obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. The investigation into his department's handling of the original case would likely result in additional charges for evidence tampering and witness intimidation. It's over, Maria said simply. Justice for your friends, and justice for this town. Marcus closed the folder. Is it, though? Blackwood said this went deeper than we knew. What if there are other victims? Other cover-ups? Then we'll find them. The State Attorney General is launching a comprehensive investigation into corruption in this county. Every case Kowalski handled, every audit Blackwood conducted, every financial transaction the church made, it's all going to be examined with a microscope. They sat together as darkness fell over the lake, both lost in thought about the events that had finally brought truth to light after 9 years of lies. Maria, Marcus said eventually, thank you for believing me, for pursuing this when everyone else wanted to let it stay buried. Thank you for coming back. If you hadn't returned to town, if that camera hadn't washed up when it did, she shrugged. Sometimes I think there are forces beyond our understanding that ensure justice eventually prevails. Marcus thought about that as he drove back to the lake house. The coincidences had been remarkable. His decision to return to Millbrook Falls for the first time in 9 years, the camera washing up just days before his arrival, the photographer finding it in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Had it been divine intervention, or just the kind of random chance that eventually brings all secrets to light? Marcus wasn't sure he believed in God anymore, but he was beginning to believe in something. Call it justice, call it karma, call it the stubborn human refusal to let evil have the final word. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the Lakeshore Community Church as Father Michael consecrated the memorial garden that had been planted in honor of David, Sarah, Tommy, and Rebecca. The garden occupied the space where the old church office building had stood. The building that had been torn down when investigators discovered it contained a hidden safe full of incriminating financial documents. The trial of Robert Blackwood and his accomplices had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including Marcus's recording of Blackwood's confession at Willow Point, all 3 defendants had pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. They would spend the rest of their lives in prison, and their assets had been seized to compensate the families of their victims and the organizations they had defrauded. Pastor Hartley had maintained his innocence to the end, claiming he had been manipulated by Blackwood and was unaware of the money laundering scheme. But the evidence told a different story. and he too was serving a life sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. The church itself had survived the scandal, though not unchanged. Under Father Michael's leadership, it had implemented strict financial oversight and transparency measures. The congregation was smaller now. Many members had been unable to reconcile their faith with the revelation that their spiritual leaders had been criminals. But those who remained seemed more committed to genuine service rather than comfortable religion. Marcus had stayed in Millbrook Falls longer than he'd originally planned. His editor at the Chicago newspaper had been understanding about his extended leave, especially when Marcus's investigation had resulted in a series of award-winning articles about corruption in small-town America. But more importantly, Marcus had found something in the pursuit of justice for his friends that he'd been missing for 9 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond exposing other people's crimes. He'd decided to stay permanently, taking a job with the regional newspaper and buying his aunt's lake house from the estate. It wasn't about returning to faith. He still had too many questions and doubts for that. But it was about returning to community, to the idea that people could work together for good even in the aftermath of great evil. Detective Maria Santos had been promoted to chief detective and was leading the ongoing investigation into other cases that might have been affected by the corruption network. She'd become more than a professional colleague to Marcus. Their shared pursuit of justice had evolved into something deeper, though both were taking it slowly. As the memorial service concluded, Marcus found himself standing beside the graves of his 4 friends in the church cemetery. New headstones had been erected, replacing the empty markers that had stood for 9 years. The inscriptions were simple but honest: "Beloved servants of God and seekers of truth." "I'm sorry it took so long," Marcus said quietly to the graves. "I'm sorry I gave up on you, on the truth, on everything you believed in." A hand touched his shoulder and he turned to see Father Michael standing beside him. "They forgave you long ago," the priest said. "The question is whether you can forgive yourself." Marcus considered that. "I'm working on it. That's all any of us can do. Work on forgiveness, work on justice, work on being better than we were yesterday." Father Michael gestured toward the lake, where the afternoon sun was painting the water in shades of gold. "Your friends knew something that it took you 9 years to rediscover. Which was, that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. That justice may be delayed, but it's never truly defeated. That even when faith is lost, love remains, and love is what drives us to seek truth and fight for the vulnerable." Marcus looked out at the lake where his friends had died, where their bodies had rested for years before finally being discovered and given the dignity of proper burial. The water was peaceful now, no longer holding secrets, no longer hiding crimes. "Do you think they knew?" he asked. "In those final moments, do you think they knew their deaths would eventually lead to justice?" Father Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I think they knew something even more important," he said finally. "They knew their lives had meaning, that they had tried to do what was right even when it was dangerous. That knowledge, that peace, is something no murderer can take away." As Marcus walked back toward his car, he passed the memorial garden where flowers bloomed in memory of 4 friends who had died for seeking truth. The garden would grow and flourish in the years to come, a living testament to the idea that good can emerge from evil, that light can shine in the darkness, that justice, however delayed, will eventually have its day. Marcus Sullivan had come home to Millbrook Falls as a broken man seeking rest. He would stay as a whole man seeking purpose. The lake that had once represented loss and mystery now represented renewal and hope. Not the naive hope of his youth, when he'd believed that good people were always protected and truth always triumphed easily, but the harder, more valuable hope of experience, the knowledge that even in a world where evil exists and flourishes, there are people willing to fight for justice, willing to speak for the voiceless, willing to ensure that no death goes unmourned and no crime goes unpunished. The camera that had washed up on Willow Point had contained more than just a final photograph. It had contained the seeds of redemption, not just for Marcus Sullivan, but for an entire community that had learned the hard way that faith without justice is empty, that peace without truth is fragile, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith is refusing to let evil have the final word. In the end, David Chen, Sarah Martinez, Thomas Brennan, and Rebecca Walsh had gotten their justice. And Marcus Sullivan had gotten something he hadn't dared hope for: the chance to honor their memory by continuing their work, seeking truth wherever it led. and building a community worthy of their sacrifice. The lake kept its new secrets now, secrets of healing rather than hiding, of growth rather than decay, of hope emerging from the depths of despair like a body rising toward the light. The end.